Hello, and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Joe Olson. I do communications here at Fresh Energy, and I'm here today to share with you a recording of the final webinar in our Intersection of Energy and Community four-part series. In this discussion, Fresh Energy's Margaret Hendrick, Lead Director of Energy Transition, is joined by Margaret Garascia of Elevate and Keith Kinch of Block Power to discuss electricity instead of gas and specifically how communities can embrace efficiency and electrification and avoid new fossil gas infrastructure. Special thank you to Great River Energy for sponsoring today's conversation. And with that, let's begin.
Welcome to everyone for joining us today for part 4, which represents our final installment of Fresh Energy's Intersection of Energy and Community webinar series. We're delighted to have you join us this afternoon. I'm Margaret Hendrick, Lead Director of the Energy Transition Department at Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota-based nonprofit working towards a vision of a just, prosperous, and resilient future powered by a shared commitment to carbon neutrality. Greenhouse gas emissions are increasing at the fastest rate across the building sector in Minnesota. Since 2005, emissions have increased by 32% from residential buildings and 15% from commercial buildings, primarily as a result of on-site combustion of fossil fuels like natural gas. As we tackle how best to reduce these emissions, we know that embracing energy efficiency and electrification and avoiding new fossil gas infrastructure will be really critical parts of the solution. To address the carbon emissions from existing buildings, we must drive aggressive, deep energy retrofits, coupled with the conversion of appliances like furnaces, air conditioners, water heaters, stoves, and clothes dryers to renewable carbon-free electricity. And that's especially true in cold climates like in the Midwest. We're hoping that everyone who joins us today and listens to the recording of today's webinar, we're calling Electricity Instead of Gas, will walk away with an understanding of the strategies and tools to make that happen, especially in multifamily buildings. Together, we need to grow a shared commitment to strategies beyond business as usual energy efficiency and the continued acceptance of natural gas as the least cost fuel source. Over the next hour, our panel of experts will discuss how communities can embrace efficiency and electrification, as well as avoid new fossil gas infrastructure. But before we dive into our conversation today, I would like to extend a shout out and a thank you to all of our promotional partners who helped spread the word about the event today. Thank you to AIA, CERTS, Climate Generation, Midwest BDC, Minnesota Electrical Association, MNSEA, Pollen, RMI, Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, and WSB. I also want to recognize Great River Energy, our sponsor for today's conversation. Thank you. Now, switching gears, I am very excited to be joined today by Margaret Garascia, Associate Director at Elevate, with offices based in the Midwest, and Keith Kinch, co-founder and general manager of New York City-based Block Power. We're going to start out with a panel discussion and then move into a Q&A for the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Many of you submitted questions in advance, but if you didn't, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, to send in your questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. We're going to be covering a lot today, so I want to dive right in. So starting with you, Keith, could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself, about Block Power, about your journey in clean energy and building electrification?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Keith Kinch, as mentioned, co-founder and general manager of Block Power. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Parents are from Barbados. Spent a lot of time around social justice and organizing as a child, and still doing it today, but around climate justice. In terms of Block Power, we're a clean tech startup. We are entering our 8th year in existence. And what we do utilizing our software platform is we provide engineering analysis, we finance projects, we do project management for all our clean energy projects. And at the end, we also do measurement and verification to confirm optimal performance of the new systems, and also work with building owners or governments or utilities on savings. We've completed over 1,400 projects in the last 8 years, many of them in New York State, and we're currently working in 25 other cities across the country. And happy to be on.
Great. And turning to you, Margaret, could you tell us a bit more about your role at Elevate and the work that you guys are doing across the Midwest?
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, Margaret, and the Fresh Energy team, and Keith for being here too. I'm excited to get going with this conversation. I'm Margaret Garascia. I'm Associate Director for Research and Innovation at Elevate. We're a Midwest-based nonprofit, though we have a national footprint. And we're primarily known for implementing utility energy efficiency programs focused on affordable multifamily housing. So we've retrofitted over 60,000 units of affordable housing across the country. We also run electricity real-time pricing programs where folks can pay the real price instead of the flat rate for electricity, and therefore shift and save money and reduce carbon emissions. And we do energy planning as well. But where I sit in the research and innovation group, we incubate new ideas and try to get them to scale. So big focus right now is on electrification, how we marry that with our other program offerings, and how we make sure that it's equitable and works for the people and the building stock that we care the most about, which are namely folks with lower incomes who rent. So really excited to dig a little deeper today. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you both so much for spending your time with us today and having this conversation. It's an important one. We're really on the precipice of a really large energy transition, and mounting this in the Midwest is of particular interest, I know, to a lot of our listeners today, and especially given, the challenges of cold climate and very different political circumstances in the Midwest as compared to the East and the West Coast. So jumping into some questions here, you both are helping communities to embrace electrification, especially in multifamily housing, which is often known as a pretty difficult part of the housing sector to embrace, just in terms of retrofits. So, historically, the cost of gas, especially natural gas, has been cheaper than electricity. So given this challenge, how do we scale electrification? Especially when the price of electricity today is higher. So Keith, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think the very short answer is investment in infrastructure. That's the only reason why gas now is considered cheaper than electricity. There's an antidote I use, and there's a time many years ago where there was an uprising in anger over using oil in buildings. People preferred wood and putting their hands over wood because it felt better. But then we made major national infrastructure investments in oil, and we became a fossil fuel country. Then when we shifted more to gas, we did the same thing again. We doubled down on gas infrastructure. So the thing we have to do moving forward, and we're seeing it in many locations in the country, is to invest in renewable energy in our electrical grids to lower the costs. But that's just financial costs. When we think about cost of electricity versus gas, there's also an equity issue and there's a health issue. We're still in the midst of a pandemic in this country, and we know more than ever clean air is important. Fossil fuels do not provide clean air, and they can be an exacerbating factor for asthma or other items in airborne areas. So electricity is going to make it much easier to make sure we're safer and cleaner. So that's how I think we deal with the current pricing of electricity versus heat. What is the cost of health? What is the cost of safety?
That's great. So really thinking more holistically about how we're subsidizing current fuels today, and then also the implications, the real equity implications of public health and the emissions that we see from these fuels. So that's great. So building off of that, Margaret, what's your perspective? And I think we have a couple of slides to share for you as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Keith said. I think we have to make the case and capture and articulate all the non-energy benefits associated with this work. So totally agree with that. And yeah, if we want to put the slide up, the way Elevate approaches this topic is that we don't approach electrification in a vacuum, right? We have to combine it with these other tools that are proven, right? So energy efficiency is always going to be the first step and the cheapest step, right? Reduce the load that you have to electrify as much as you possibly can. There's lots of proven ways to do that, particularly in the multifamily space. Then we electrify. Then we look at renewables, ideally at the site, and distributed energy resources for that building. And then we can manage those loads. So I mentioned that we run real-time pricing programs. We can shift and save. There's some really innovative work happening with hot water heaters that can kind of heat water at off-peak times and then distribute that throughout the day based on customer demand. So these all have to happen in concert, and we have to kind of integrate that conversation. And to bring in Keith's point, we have to be talking about health at the same time, right? And resiliency. We're adding cooling for folks. That's a huge benefit that we have to talk about. But Margaret, you raise a really good point that the costs, the fundamentals are a big challenge. So Joe, if you could go to the next slide. I'm including this as an example from one of our projects. So this is a multifamily pre-war building in Chicago, currently has gas individual furnaces and stoves, central gas hot water, and gas laundry. And so what I'm showing is just electrification. So even though I was just saying we have to integrate those other strategies, I just wanted to isolate the point about the energy and cost changes when you simply electrify. So this is going to cold climate ducted heat pumps, and we can achieve a 61% site energy reduction, which is incredible. And that's because of the technology, right? How efficient these heat pumps are. And I just note that we're adding the blue slice, we're adding cooling. We didn't have cooling before. So that's incredible. But then the way that translates into costs, we don't see that as much. You see about a 3% reduction. And that's different for tenants versus owners because of the way those end uses are split out. And this particular utility, this is ComEd, offers an all electric rate. So a rate for customers who have electric heating, and we can get 8% savings. But we're not coming anywhere near that 61% savings on the energy side. And that's because we choose to keep the cost of natural gas and other fossil fuels low. We as a society subsidize that as a fuel. And so my point is that what I'm showing on the left is empirical, right? That's data and that's real. And what I'm showing on the right is what we as a society have decided the cost should be and the value should be in this transition, and what we can absolutely change going forward.
Wow, this is really great data to be taking a look at, especially data that's being collected in the Midwest, where we think a lot about heating reliability, and we're also thinking a lot about, as you mentioned, Margaret, load growth. As we mount this energy transition, we electrify end uses, we're really going to have to be intentional about sustainably growing that load so we don't overburden our grid. So with those points in mind, Margaret, your work with Elevate has allowed you to really push the envelope here and start to pilot some of this electrification work, especially across affordable multifamily homes. Could you talk a little bit more about your experiencing with transitioning a multifamily building on to clean electricity?
Yeah, where to start? There's so many things that we could unpack. So there's a particular path we want to go down, either from you, Margaret, or Keith, or from the audience. Please bring that forward. But I'll just talk about a couple of the big kind of themes that have emerged for us. One is meeting owners where they're at, right? There's a lot of just confusion or questions or skepticism about electrification. Why would I do this now if I don't have to? Or I'm watching these gas bans coming. I'm really worried there's going to be a stick and not a carrot for me to comply with that. How do I figure this out for my portfolio? So that's been a big thing, is just looking at their buildings, their benchmarking data, and understanding how we can help and how we can design approaches that meet the affordable building stock where it is today. And it's facing a lot of challenges, right? With the pandemic, a lot of our owners' rent rolls are down, tenants are struggling. So we're trying to do this work in a challenging context anyway. The other big kind of topic I'd highlight is being really sensitive about cost shifts from master metered buildings that might be switching to like an individual heat pump. So in other words, we're going from the owner kind of covering those utility costs and passing on those costs via rents or via utility allowances. to tenants potentially paying for a new end use that they did not directly pay for prior. So the last thing we want to do is increase utility costs for tenants of affordable housing, right? So it's just, in some ways, that's the central mission here, is we know heat pumps work, we know how to do energy efficiency, we know how to implement these tools, but how do we put the people first and understand how does a tenant who gets LIHEAP support for their gas bill, how do we make sure that help follows them when they move over to all electric? It might seem like a detail when you're managing like a huge construction project and a retrofit, but that is the most important question for the tenant, right? So I think those are the two things I'd highlight to start, but happy to talk more about any one of those.
That's great. And you raise a really important point, the financing on how we do this energy transition in the building sector, especially across affordable multifamily buildings, is going to be really, really important to keep track of. And I don't think anyone who is having the discussion about how to transition buildings to clean electricity today thinks that we should be doing this on the backs of individual ratepayers or building owners. So I know, Keith, you guys at Block Power have been really thinking critically about financing structures that could help to alleviate some of these barriers. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your pilot projects and the financing packages that you've been able to deploy.
Sure. First, everything Margaret said, totally agree with. And I think the one point that people take for granted, what she stated was, meeting the owner where they're at. I think you have to do that every time. One of the barriers to scalability is financing, especially in low to moderate income neighborhoods where the buildings that need the most work are sitting in those neighborhoods, and they've been historically underserved, underbanked, and now we're asking them to pay for these upgrades, whether to Margaret's point, it's a stick or a carrot or a mixture of both. So the one thing we do is, we handhold the customer from beginning to end of the process, especially on the financing. And the financing comes in two ways. One, there are utility incentives, which, many of us on this panel may know about, and we live in this space, but the average person is not going to take time to figure out what utilities have which incentives when and where the paperwork goes and when to email which person. So, we do all that in-house with the building owner or the portfolio manager. Second is the actual cost of the project. If it costs $100,000, $50,000, $10,000, even before COVID and before we had this economic struggle in the country, not everyone has the ability to pay little, if not any, of the upfront costs. So what Block Power has created over the last 2.5 years is a no money down lease option, very similar to leasing a car, where a building owner or a portfolio can say, hey, I need to put in solar batteries, heat pumps, but I don't have the upfront capital. Well, great, no money down, we'll put in the systems, and your monthly payment would be 20 to 70% less than what you're paying for annual energy costs now, and also operating and maintenance, right? Many building owners, but the portfolio managers, especially in this space, are going to be reactive. No one's thinking about their boiler or their heating systems or their cooling systems 24/7. They think about it when it goes down, or to Margaret's point, when a tenant has a concern, and then you go in there and you're concerned about comfort. So we've completed, projects in New York State and other states using our no money down lease option, and it's worked. People have lowered their carbon emissions, they've lowered their energy usage, and the one part that we don't talk about in this space is also it's job creation, right? Someone's got to install those systems or kick out the old systems, and that creates another layer of equity in historically underserved communities.
Great. And I'm glad you brought up workforce. I think that's a really important piece of this transition, both when we're talking about, as we have been, air source heat pumps, as well as ground source heat pumps. I think they're two really important areas of workforce development that we could dig into here. And so we will continue that conversation. We're going to kind of dive into a few more exploratory questions here. So sort of zooming out a little bit, what does a just energy transition look like in the building sector? Moving communities off fossil energy and onto clean electricity, again, in terms of workforce, energy security, and designing enabling policy. So, Keith, let's start with you.
Well, I think in regards to workforce, right now there's a labor shortage in general on who can actually install these new systems. So the first step is, how do we scale the workforce so that we can scale installing the systems? And that is a direct, it's a direct correlation to putting together, a just economy around energy efficiency. Historically, the construction industry labor force has been predominantly white male. And as we look to diversify, we need to be very clear on what that looks like and who is part of that next generation of workforce. And the other part that, we're not talking about is, a large part of the current workforce, they're retiring, they're aging out. And many of the children of the folks in the workforce don't have interest in doing construction. So that intellectual property that a construction manager or, Mr. A or Mrs. B's construction firm, that goes away as well, right? So we're losing some institutional knowledge. So how do we try to maintain that or keep that, one? And then two, as we train, women, people of color, underserved communities, how do we make sure that they're ready to not just, get on a job and work, which is great, but also create their own companies and also be able to be a contractor and build generational wealth. So that still goes back to policy, right? There needs to be policy in place to make sure folks have access to capital, understand access to incentives, access to understanding even how to go through the process of getting, binding insurance to complete a project or go to be permitting, which is a pain point that we still deal with at Block Power. And that's the best way to do it. It has to be top, bottom up, train people, put in positions to work, but also the policies have to match. If a contractor can't get 90 grand or getting a loan to do any level of work, nothing gets done. And then finally, the cost goes down, right? When Margaret talks about installing these systems, that cost goes down dramatically, because if you have 10 to 15 contractors that can do it instead of 5, that cost goes down because there's competition. Not everyone knows anyone. Not everyone shows up in the same Mercedes-Benz to put in the systems. So it's very helpful to move on that.
Great. And Margaret, what's your take?
Yeah, totally agree. I was like nodding my head and talking on mute, Keith, while you were talking or agreeing on mute. I agree. I'd highlight a couple things on the contractor workforce side. One is just there's an inherent kind of bias we're seeing towards larger firms. So Keith mentioned there's a lack of labor, and I would just add to that and complement that it's I think it's really on the smaller firm side. So the larger kind of mechanical firms, they're doing heat pumps and VRF, particularly in new construction, but they are these kind of legacy white, legacy organizations. So there's kind of like an intra workforce equity consideration here. We have to make sure that the smaller, more local shops are brought in and know how to do this work. So totally agree with everything that Keith said. One of the things that Elevate has had some success in doing is helping smaller and more diverse contractors with back office support. So just helping them build out their invoicing and how do they, and this is, can be specific to utility programs, but how do they navigate all the paperwork? But I think there's similar constraints with electrification. There's different permitting processes that they're going to need to become familiar with, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing I'd highlight is the manufacturers. So the manufacturers have great line of visibility into the workforce, right? Some manufacturers have certifications where if you ask them, hey, who can install a heat pump, they'll give you 3 names. But again, it does tend to be these kind of incumbents. And so we can work connecting those dots. We can connect the local, more diverse contractors with the manufacturers and vice versa, make sure they're getting trained up on the latest equipment and that they're on those lists when the manufacturer is recommending folks who can install a heat pump, for example. And then I want to pick up the cost point. Far and away, our biggest cost in our projects is labor. And I think we're seeing a lack of competition, agree with Keith there, but we're also seeing just some risk pricing, right? The different trades, first of all, the number of trades that are involved in building electrification is amazing and exciting and a talking point that we should all be talking about. You need a plumber, you need an electrician, you need a mechanical, you need general trades, because like if you're swapping in a new electric stove, you need someone to come in and run that conduit and then drywall and paint, right? There's just so many opportunities to bring workers in and pay them good, high-paying wages. But to my point about risk, I think this is a newer area. So we're seeing some pricing come in that's like, I've never done a conduit run that long and electrified a hot water heater. And so we do expect and anticipate that in the coming years very quickly will come down and just help on all sides, help drive competition, help us get more volume and keep expanding this work.
Great. And I think, we've talked a little bit about this, but I wonder if you both could touch on some of the enabling policy that we might need to put into place or advocate for to kind of drive this transition as it relates to workforce, as it relates to, market transformation. We've seen energy transitions mounted before. I think the power sector is a good example. And we've made some mistakes in the past. Folks who are most affected by policy have not been at the table to have a voice in making that policy. So I wonder if you guys could both just reflect on the dynamics there and what we can do to make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes we've made in the past.
Sure. I think to your, I think to your first point, you have to put frontline communities first. I think the last 2.5 years between our health crisis and, where we are on energy efficiency and climate change, we understand, who needs to be on the front of the line in regards to the benefits of what we're trying to do. I think the three policy points that need to happen. One, there needs to be concerted effort by utilities to incentivize electrification, right? Not rebates, incentivize upfront, right? It needs to be upfront so that folks know what they're getting and how much how much cost is coming off right away from a given upgrade. I think 2, there needs to be more mechanisms around technical guidance, right? To Margaret's point, when you're working with 4 or 5 union shops and you may have 2 or 3 buildings, the ability to allow a building owner to navigate that process needs to be more streamlined. And that can be done policy-wise, right? How we go through Department of Building permitting, how does a building get to a point where they know what they need to do? The third one, which is, people don't like, for all the carrots we talk about, it's got to be a stick, right? Some people need a little nudge. And in New York City, we have a couple of nudges that I think are great to utilize as a base point to get our policies done. So in New York, every building has a letter grade from A to F. So, like many people, we get excited to go to A restaurant, but if you eat at an A restaurant, you live in a C+ building or a C+ home, it doesn't matter around health. So there's a conversation around, letting building owners know, hey, this is a bad building, what are you doing? And then there are fines that come with it. And then there are deadlines on how long gas can be utilized. To Margaret's point about the fear of if there's a gas ban, what do I do next? So, New York City, they're looking to, ban gas in new construction by 2025, right? And what does that mean for existing buildings and others? So that all has to happen at the same time. It sounds like a lot, but if it does, that means that that's how far behind we are, right, on the things we have to do. And then finally, we have to make sure that, to Margaret's point, the legacy organizations can't run it. Can't be the same 5, 6, 7 big companies. It has to be the mom and pop contractors. It has to be the nonprofits and advocacy groups on the ground that have toiled for years with limited resources to get this done. And now there are resources coming, and it's allocated appropriately.
Yeah, I'd highlight a couple things. I think Illinois has had some success, but also some learnings about how to do this with the Future Energy Jobs Act and with Illinois Solar for All. One of the big learnings is, and we saw this with recovery funds during the Obama years too, is actually, you don't want to train people up and then not have a pipeline of work. And so I think that's a critical piece. And there's a lot of excitement and talk about how there might be some federal dollars coming through various streams that are currently being negotiated in DC. And so I think we all recognize that we want the workforce to be there, but we want the converse to be true, right? Like we don't want to train up a workforce and have people pivot from traditional electrician jobs to electrification and then not have projects for them. And there are certain policy things that you can include to make sure that those connections are made, that projects that get certain funding streams are tapping workforce trainees from programs, and just make those connections really, really salient. But I agree with Keith that we probably need carrots and sticks to get where we need to go, and that workforce has to be integrated along the way in those policy conversations to make sure we don't repeat some of the mistakes of the past.
Great. Thank you guys for your insights here. So if we're now kind of transitioning to talking about, the Midwest specifically, it's cold here. We've got a very different political system. We've got an electric grid that sees peak demand for electricity that's being supplied to air conditioners in the summer. So with electrifying our buildings, we're expecting that peak demand now to shift to summertime, to wintertime, driven by heating. So to you guys, what does a sustainable and reliable transition in multifamily housing look like in the Midwest? So Keith, let's start with you.
Well, I think it starts with understanding which buildings are in the most need to make the switch from fossil fuels, right? Whether is it based on the system, age of system, and based on geography. That's one. Two, once we identify that, which many utilities and governments may have already in the Midwest, having a concerted effort with dollars behind it, real dollars, whether it's state and, to Margaret's point, some federal dollars coming down, hopefully, to make that part of a large scale program, right? If we're gonna, to my earlier point, invest and buy in on the infrastructure and electrification, this is how, right? And for many folks, I understand that the term climate change and other things can be very polarizing and turn people off, but this is about two things. Then it's a job component. It's a job stimulus component. If we swap out these old systems, put in new systems, we're creating jobs. Two, it's a health component. How do we keep people healthy now and moving forward? And then three, we have to build our infrastructure. We can't have an older infrastructure that's trapped in the 20th century, in the Midwest or otherwise. So Margaret mentioned Illinois. I know there's some conversations in other states as well. And obviously nothing is cookie cutter, but those are the first key steps. And it starts from the top, on the state level, and then we get down to the city level. Because if we're not only on the state level, we're just going to have 4 or 5 cities, like many states now, that are doing X, and then we'll have other cities that are buying into gas, right? And that doesn't help long-term what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think I don't want to underscore, or I do want to underscore that this is a real challenge in the cold climate. And in our context. I think we have to look to local experts like Fresh, like many folks on the call, to understand what is the building stock like, what needs the most weatherization, and how. Chicago has a lot of brick housing, so we can't do overcladding. I know Minnesota, you all might have more frame, right? So it's like, I think we can't kid ourselves that there's going to be a one size fits all solution. And we also need to acknowledge that we probably do need backup heat of some kind in the upper Midwest. I'm of the mind that that can be electric resistance, which is in the newer models of heat pumps is integrated into the system. So the occupant or the tenant does not need to mess with, on a cold day, the backup. It's automatic. I know there are folks probably in the chat advocating for some kind of gas backups. I think that's a whole thread of conversation that we could pull on more. I also think we have to acknowledge that if the grid goes down in the winter, that's a problem for anybody that has a furnace with a fan. That's a problem for the heat for a lot of folks anyway in the winter. So again, we can't have a siloed conversation about this without also talking about grid resilience, right? You can't talk about electrification without that. Those two go hand in hand. So again, not being naive about the need to do that. But I just want to emphasize that if you talk to a building science engineer and you're committed to doing weatherization while you do electrification, they will tell you that if the system is designed right, the technology is here today to meet the heating load, even in a polar vortex. And so I think part of what I want to communicate to this group is that we don't need to wait. The time for waiting is over. We need to start doing this. We need to start implementing. We need to start looking to those local experts and understanding what's the specific context for this market or this geography or this climate. And then we just need to start doing. We are a little bit behind other markets, so we can look to California and some of their learnings about the duck curve, which is really specifically about solar offtake in the afternoons, but we can learn from those mistakes, and as we think about DERs integrated with heat pumps, but the technology is here. It's time to just start electrifying.
Great. And then I just wanted to quickly dig in a little bit more specifically on affordable housing. So can you just talk about a few of the nuances that we should be aware of in doing a sustainable, just transition and affordable multifamily housing?
Yeah, I'll take that one first. I think we've hit on some of them, but it has to be kind of tenant first. We have to think about the whole tenant experience from beginning to end. We have to engage tenants and talk to them, with them, hear from them. We have to educate about heat pumps and the added cooling benefits. We need to make sure that this is not a new approach that's just being put on and dropped on, right? I think we don't want to pass something like a building performance standard that has a requirement for affordable housing, and those folks have not been at the table, right? So we need process equity when we're designing policies that are going to affect affordable housing. But I think we need to really just think about, again, those cost shifts, because I'm confident that the technology can work for affordable housing, that we're going to achieve those carbon reductions. And then getting back to the workforce conversation too, we want to employ folks from communities where we're electrifying, right? So we have to bring those threads of the conversation together at the same time.
No, absolutely. I think, what you hear from many affordable housing folks are, the numbers don't add up, right? It's the bottom line. And they mean that from their perspective, from the tenants, right? I know for many locations, there's a certain percentage of threshold a tenant can pay on their energy bill, and that varies obviously state to state. So they're aware of that. They're also aware of what they can charge for rent. So that's how they think about items. There's three things that you can deal with. One, obviously change how much money can you allocate to affordable housing, right? To make sure the same investment you made to build affordable housing from a city or state or federal level, you can add on to that, so that some of that alleviation is done, to Margaret's point, on a tenant level as well as the building owner level or portfolio level. Two, Margaret, whatever point about weatherization and other systems, one of the things we talk to building owners about, if they have a concern about increase of costs for tenants on electricity, think about community solar, think about solar in the building. Like if the building is an asset, then you should think about it as a total asset, right? How do you make sure it works top to bottom? Just putting in a brand new system to say, oh, here's some Ductless mini splits. That's great, but if the windows are 25 years old, it doesn't matter if you put in a new system. Or if you're, to Margaret's point, if your load calculations are off, it's not going to work. So if you're going to make that investment to go from gas to electricity, or just all fossil fuels in general, take the whole building, make the whole building at that level, and then also work, like you said, work with the tenants, right? Certain tenants have, and to your point, have heating concerns and cooling concerns. What does that look like? The one thing, which is very nuanced, in New York City, you have a lot of air conditioners sitting out of windows, right? So if you go to air source heat pumps, they're nowhere, essentially you're removing air conditioning from windows, which of course, what does that mean? It's cost effective, but also how does that change the structure of the tenant's life, right? If I'm used to turning on the AC and standing by it and, getting cool, now what does it mean if I have a 2-zone system in my 3-bedroom apartment? What does that look like? So once again, to Margaret's point, like, are you talking to tenants? Are you talking to the folks on the ground? Are you thinking about customer education, right? So they don't feel like, oh, this new system's in, here's a remote, go figure it out. That's not going to work, and it's not going to be adopted properly. You're going to be like, I'm used to X. So definitely agree on that.
Great. Okay, we're going to do our final round of questions here. We're going to do it lightning round. So real quick responses from you guys. We're going to get into a discussion of barriers and opportunities. So what is it going to take for us to do better to speed this transition, meet the urgency that we know is pressing down on us with climate change? We're not meeting our greenhouse gas reduction goals in the Midwest. So what can groups like on the call today do? So we've touched on federal investment quite a bit already, but can you both quickly speak to some of the opportunities you see for leveraging federal dollars towards creating a more equitable, sustainable, and healthy building sector?
Yeah, I think we have to help when that money arrives. We have to help make sure that cities, states, localities have a pipeline, have partnerships. They're able to spend that money, and they're able to spend it equitably on the right types of programs and in the right communities. And everyone on the call can think about how that applies in their own work and in their own neck of the woods. And then I think we can all be advocating and talking about these integrated solutions, that none of these things can happen in a vacuum. We're not meeting our goals. So we have to stop subsidizing fossil, and we have to start spending money on these integrated approaches that we know work.
Yeah, I agree. I would quickly add, look at all the success you've had across the work you've done and utilize that as a way to build a plan, right? Many times people say, this sounds great. It's a great idea. And you're like, no, it's not a great idea. We're doing it. It's done. Now we're going to scale, right? This is not like we're thinking about making a cake. We made 3 cakes already. They taste great. We need to make another 1,000 cakes. I'm a cake person, sorry. So, that's how we have to think about it around energy efficiency. Like, replicate what's been successful and just add dollars and add the right voices to it.
Great. Scaling. I love that. So real quick then, what are the barriers to innovation as you see them? What does it take to be a leader in this energy transition?
I would say technology, having the right technology, and Margaret is right. It's technology is here now, but understanding the right technology for building the right systems. So we're not moving people to the wrong systems. I think that's important. That's on the folks on the ground. That's on the manufacturers. 2, financing. It's got to be flexible, right? We can't have people concerned about losing their homes over upgrades in systems, and we need people to have access. Gotta have access.
I think cost effectiveness and our collective mindset and fixation on that is one of our biggest barriers. Weatherization, poses some huge opportunities and challenges to make electrification move forward without being stuck in some of these cost effectiveness frameworks. In particular, the fact that you can't take into account the fixed customer charge of gas, because it's just that something they ever thought about when they were thinking about energy efficiency. And obviously with fuel switching, that makes a huge impact. So it's things like that. And same with the utility context. So I agree, Keith, that like that's the utility funding model is probably the best train we have going, but we have to figure out a way out of this cost effectiveness framework, or else electrification is just going to run into a buzzsaw.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We have a lot of work to do to reimagine our cost effectiveness framework. We've talked about non-energy benefits, public health, taking full account of the emissions, versus on-site and source. And I think, that has implications for both electricity as well as the current gas sources that we're using. So really great insights. Thank you guys so much. We are going to pivot now to the Q&A session. And just a quick reminder, I see that there are some great questions coming into the Q&A box. So please go ahead, keep dropping those questions in. You can use the upvote function to really highlight questions that are of interest to you. But before we start the Q&A, I would like to quickly remind everyone that if you missed any of the 4 parts of our Intersection of Energy and Community webinar series, you can tune in on Decarbonize, the Clean Energy podcast, which you can find on any podcasting app or at fresh-energy.org/decarbonize. You will also be able to find a link to a YouTube recording of this webinar, complete with slides, on our website at fresh-energy.org/publications. And while we're on the subject of events, registration is now open for our virtual benefit breakfast on October 14th, featuring Keith's colleague, award-winning climate tech entrepreneur, Danelle Baird, CEO of New York City-based Block Power, an organization proving that businesses can tackle carbon pollution while making a profit and creating family-sustaining jobs. You can go ahead and register at fresh-energy.org/benefit breakfast. And finally, this is our first public announcement. We're very excited. So here live on this webinar that Fresh Energy has just launched a new gas decarbonization program led by our newest hire, Joe Dammel, formerly working at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and also the Minnesota Attorney General's office. And we are hitting the ground running on a new Future of Gas docket opening at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. For all those energy wonks out there, this is docket number 21-565. Stay tuned to our website in the coming days for an official announcement. Okay, we're going to move to Q&A now. I will look through all of the questions and start fielding them. Let's get started with a question from Liz. And I think this is one that both of you will be able to take a crack at here. So Liz asks, low-income households will be the last to transition off fossil fuels simply because they do not have the money to afford to upgrade their electrical wiring and change from gas or oil to electricity. Thus, they risk becoming stranded on the gas utility as more non-low-income customers electrify. Have any of you given any thought to how existing low-income weatherization and home repair programs can be modified to enable carbon reduction and not just energy reduction? Great question.
I'll start there. Yes, we are thinking about this. I think the feared gas utility death spiral is motivating much of Elevate's work. We do not want low-income folks to be left behind and paying the increasing fixed costs as customers flee the gas distribution system. So absolutely, I referenced weatherization earlier. There's so much we can do. I know that conversations are happening right now on the Hill about this. How do we tweak things? I'd highlight California and New York state weatherization programs as having some innovative approaches to integrating heat pumps with solar into their measure packages. But there's so much. I think it boils down to the way, well, first of all, weatherization uses a really old modeling system that's not supported anymore, actually. It's like an old iteration of Excel. And so think that's an example of like, we should bring that into the new way of doing things and use the tools that we have and update the way that they like literally model their measure packages. And then getting back to the cost effectiveness, there are a lot of things we can do so that those the way those benefits get calculated don't tip the scale towards fossil and further electrification.
Yes to the question and yes to Margaret's points. Yeah, we're fortunate in New York State to have a great weatherization programs, but also we're fortunate in the sense that the New York State government listens to the market in regards to how to scale and innovate. We're really fortunate for that. So yeah, on any given day, you know, members of the Block Art team, we're talking to low to moderate income building owners and completing projects. And you're right, the two things that always come up no matter what are the load calculations in a building, the electrical load in a building. If the building was built even in 1980, it can barely charge 4 cell phones and a laptop. Now we're asking it to heat and cool a building. And we work very closely with utilities on that. And, you know, part of our lease model is we take all those costs into one. So it isn't like you're constantly getting a new bill. Like this is all done in one shot. Like this is the cost of the project at the end. And to Margaret's point again, you know, working with smaller to medium-sized contractors, being able to say, can you do this work? Are you trained? That also lowers the cost of the project as well. And then finally, the incentives have to be increased. Like Margaret said it several times, and she's right. The only reason why gas is cheap is because the incentives has been incentivized to be cheap. If we spent 30% more of what we did to invest in gas, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So, I mean, that is the goal. You know, that is how we get buildings that are considered to be last in line to move up to the front of the line. And we're seeing it more, you know, in New York, we're seeing it in California. I would even add Massachusetts. You know, I know they're redoing their 3-year plan under National Grid, incentivizing heat pumps. Yeah, and it's the incentive, you know, that's the key.
Great. Okay, moving to a question from Kelly that came through at the time of registration. So is it practical to transition to electricity now before there is increased resilience of our distribution system? What if the grid goes down in the middle of winter? And let's focus this question using the Midwestern grid, because of course, as we know, where you get your electric supply really determines your resilience for questions like this. So who wants to take a swing at this first?
I'll start. I mean, yes, I think earlier in conversation we hit on grid resilience has to be part of this conversation. I think there's a tendency to think like, or model, like we're going to flip a switch and thousands of heat pumps are going to be added at once, which would undoubtedly be a tricky thing for the grid to manage. And that's just simply not going to happen. It's also why I'm motivated to keep pushing on this work and keep scaling. So, I mean, we are actively having this conversation with the electric utilities that we work with. They are all over it. So without getting like too much into the weeds in the little time we have, the conversation is happening and there's so much to unpack there, but I don't think it should be a barrier for any one individual or organization in pursuing some of these solutions.
Yeah, and I also, you know, the easy answer is say yes, and I agree with Margaret. The other answer is like, what type of building do you have? You know, the building stock, and what is your current loading usage? And what's the building being used for? And now we still have the technology to put you in the best position in that worst case scenario, right? So yeah, I would tell you to do it now. Not just because you don't want to call and it sounds good, but also, you know, we don't know what comes on the line in regards to a stick from the city or the state or government, right? There's something that more in New York State, when we talk to building owners' portfolios, they fear the stick more than the carrots right now. Just like we waited, and now there's local law 97, and now it's local law 95, and now there's this law, and now I've got to check off this box, and now my building grades is C, and now I've got to incur 70 grand in fines. That's only because they were waiting for something. And sometimes, you've got to be the early adopter, you got to be the leader, and you got to be ahead of the curve on this. So I would say do it, and, work closely with folks like Margaret on the ground that know this in and out to get it done.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we've talked a lot about pairing energy efficiency work with electrification, especially in the Midwest. That's just so critically important, both to sustainably grow that new demand on the grid so that we aren't overtaxing it as we ramp up with this energy transition, but also recognizing that, the building stock that we have today in the Midwest is nowhere near as energy efficient as it should be, as it is. Folks are really strapped with pretty egregious energy bills. So that is a big problem. So if we're mounting a transition where we're pairing energy efficiency with electrification, there's a lot of, I think, good data out there to demonstrate that with tighter building envelopes, you're keeping that heat in your building much more efficiently. So if there is an instance in which you lose power, it's not going to be as horrific as if you're on a different energy source with an unweatherized house. So this is an energy transition about resiliency as much as it is about electrification. So I think that's important to note as well. And with MISO, this is a grid that we rely on in the Midwest that has a lot of redundancy already built into it. And so as we saw over this past winter, even with our polar vortex event where we saw the grid in Texas going down, we didn't have the same types of problems because of that way the grid is structured. So let's move into lightning round. So I'm going to ask for quick answers, and I'll ask one or the other of you for these answers. So Margaret, this one's for you. And this is talking about backup gas and decarbonized gas. So can pursuing decarbonization of the natural gas supply by 30% via zero carbon hydrogen generated off-peak be a valuable strategy to pursue concurrently with building electrification?
No, I mean, I would leave that to you, Margaret, and your new colleague. I think there are experts who are looking at, lower carbon gas. I tend to be a skeptic there. I will say that we've had conversations with building owners about leaving in their radiators and their steam distribution so that in 10 years, maybe there will be a low carbon option to pick that up and use that again. So the door is open, I would say.
And I'll add 30% is just a concentration of hydrogen in our current energy system. The pipes cannot handle that. 7% is the max that I've heard that you can mix in before you deal with the pipes breaking down from embrittlement. Okay, so Keith, this is a question for you. In New York, who determines the building letter grade?
That's done through the Department of Buildings in partnership with the mayor's office. So when you walk down a beautiful block in New York and you see a bunch of A, Bs, and Cs, it's Department of Buildings. And the building owner has a relatively good amount of time to figure out how to make that grade higher. Now, the one thing which is interesting about that law, if there isn't enough data to get a grade for a building, you get an automatic F. Just like school, when you come in incomplete, you get an F. So a lot of buildings have Fs, and it may be because they've not completed their work or provided enough data. So just something to think about.
Great. Okay, and then let's do last question here for, let's go with Margaret. So this is a question from Sean. Can inclusive on-bill tariff-based financing be helpful to expand access to affordable capital and enable renters to pay off the energy improvements on their utility bill with future tenants continuing to make the payments?
Yeah, I think on-bill is definitely a tool in the toolbox. That's how I think about it. There's probably other financing approaches that we need to be able to leverage for different contexts, but absolutely on-bill is part of the solution.
Great. And we do have quite a few questions left here. So I know we're at time, but I wonder if Margaret and Keith would be generous enough to stay on for another couple minutes to get through some more of these questions.
Absolutely.
Okay. And for folks that do have to hop off, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to being in touch again. Please visit Fresh Energy's website for all of the resources that we've discussed today. So I will look through, maybe this is a question for Keith from Jean. Has Block Power worked on any projects in Minnesota?
I have to double check. I know we have a number that we're planning to work on, and most of them actually are single family that are running on gas. That I know for sure. And to Margaret's point about the concern around having a backup system, that has come up in conversations. And for anything to work in Minnesota, I want to work with Elevate down there and work with Fresh Energy in the Midwest. The one thing we say at the company, building owners trust other building owners, but also they trust their stakeholders in their communities. So I can say a lot of things and it's really nice. But if Margaret says it or Margaret Fresh Energy says it goes a long way because they trust them more. And that's how we're going to scale. But yeah, a lot of the projects we're looking at, they're smaller systems, like, 3-4 bedroom single family homes that are looking to electrify more for zoning purposes and for comfort, right? They understand the cost of gas is cheaper, but what's the point if you've got to turn the switch up to make sure the second bedroom is warm and then the kitchen is burning, right? So zoning has become a big issue in comfort.
Great. Okay, this is a question from Margaret from Pat. And I think this harkens back to the slides that you showed around energy and cost savings. So I think the question is, would be better served perhaps to use source energy and carbon. Site energy tends to hide the electricity generation and transmission footprint. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the pros, cons, both on electric and fossil side of using site versus source energy.
I probably buried the lead that the point of our pilot is carbon reduction. And so that particular project, we're going to achieve a 25% carbon reduction. So I agree that, we look at both, of course, but just the point I was trying to make was really around the costs, which are driven by the kWh and the therms, which is obviously then the analogous point is site energy. But don't disagree. And obviously, if this is a carbon strategy, we're taking into account the source generation associated with electricity. So yeah, totally agree.
And I'll just add, a lot of the source energy calculations are pretty subpar, even as it relates to fossil today, in as much as they're not taking into account, similar to how we do line loss for electric transmission, we're not taking into account the fugitive methane emissions that are lost across the gas system through gas leaks, which are highly carbon intensive because they're methane, and that's over 80 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. So we have quite a bit of work to do to improve our measures of source energy as well. Okay, so this is a question, I think, for both of you here. So from Lissa, I recognize that many in the energy world are now talking about electrification, but there seems to be a real gap between this conversation and what it feels like most families and households are asking for. Could you share more insights about strategies to bridge this gap?
I'm not convinced there's that gap. I mean, we talk to lower income folks who own their own homes, and they're really struggling with managing 2 utility bills. They're struggling with their gas bill, particularly in Chicago, where we have high fixed customer charges. And so we can meet them in the frame of that conversation and talk about how removing gas will mean they only have to manage 1 bill, will mean that their costs go down, and will mean that we will help bring these other solutions like weatherization and rooftop solar if their roof is appropriate for it, and bring their total bill down even more. So we can we can meet folks where they're at. I'm assuming the conversation you're highlighting, the questioner's highlighting, is around more like affordability or just day-to-day, households problems. But I 100% agree with the premise that no households are sitting at their kitchen table talking about heat pumps. I think we recognize that for sure.
Oh, Keith, you're on mute.
Sorry, I agree. I think officially the rent moratorium in New York State expires, I think, Saturday. And that's on top of mind in regards to affordability, right? For tenants, for building owners. How do I make sure this building is sustainable, right? Financially, otherwise. And then long term, as tenants think about finding new spaces, as building owners think about vacancies, how do you make your building appealing, right? If you're going to charge a higher rent because you're running an old fossil fuel system that's going to put an extra strain on your pocket, and you're thinking about handing it off to the tenant, that may not work, not just for legal purposes, just for in terms of getting a tenant to stay or even to want to commit to moving in. And then on the tenant side, to Margaret's point, it's for everyone, it's been a long year. For the other states we work in, and I'll focus on New York. Folks had to make a lot of tough decisions the last year and a half on paying, a bill, or paying rent, or buying food, or someone got sick. So it's on top of mind in regards to Marcus' point. No one's saying at the dinner table, love those Douglas Spring splits we saw driving by today, but they're thinking about how do we lower costs and how do we live a better, efficient life, and it still comes back to electrification long term.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and I am going to be pulling my MC card here, and I'm going to ask one from my perspective. And I'd love to get both of you your quick answers here. So what is the scale and pace of change needed to advance this energy transition in the building sector?
We have to go as fast as we can, as equitably as we can, without breaking anything. So do no harm. Don't increase costs for folks. Meet owners where they're at. I come back to those principles and just go.
And Keith, how about
you? Barry Allen Flash, speed of light, speed of time. We need to do it now, to all the points Margaret mentioned, but also we're in a unique window. I don't know when we're going to have this amount of federal dollars coming down, with the amount of states that are locked in thinking about this, with the amount of cities locked in thinking about this for the next 5, 6 months, 6 years. So to Margaret's point, if we can go full speed without breaking anything, and if this is time, like yesterday, I don't think we've ever had a chance to use billions of dollars over 2-3 years to focus on 2 key items that everyone is kind of locked in on, which is energy efficiency, infrastructure, job creation. It's all locked in. Let's just give all the money to Fresh Energy and Elevate, some other folks too, and then go from there.
Great. Well, what a wonderful note to end on. Thank you both so much for your time, your expertise, sharing your thoughts and experience on your work in this space and what it takes to tackle the challenge we see in the building sector today. And thanks to everyone who have tuned in to join us for the conversation today and for our preceding 3 conversations in this webinar series. Please check out Fresh Energy's website for any other resources, and we wish you all the best for a great afternoon and look forward to being in touch soon. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for tuning in to the audio recording of our webinar. If you're hungry for more or want to get involved, visit fresh-energy.org. As Margaret mentioned during the webinar, we've recently announced the keynote speaker for our 2021 virtual benefit breakfast that we're calling Future Focus, the New Climate Economy. The breakfast will take place on October 14th, and we are pleased to welcome award-winning climate tech entrepreneur Danelle Baird, CEO of Brooklyn-based Block Power. Register at fresh-energy.org/benefit breakfast. And in case you didn't know this, when you register, you can join a Fresh Energy staff or board member's virtual table. Just click the drop down at the bottom of the registration page and click who you want to sit with virtually. I think I mentioned this last time, but if you don't know anyone at Fresh Energy, why don't you sit at my table? Just click Joe Olson in the dropdown. And finally, you can support Fresh Energy's work by making a donation today. Visit our website, fresh-energy.org, and click Donate in the upper right corner. Thank you for listening.